For everyone who solves crime from their couch, knows more about forensics than their own job, and has trust issues with small-town sheriffs, Amazon Music's millions of podcast episodes are calling. Just download the Amazon Music app and start listening to your favorite true crime podcasts ad-free. Included with Prime.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, a really significant pile of documents. We've got internal memos, detailed spending records, federal court rulings, quite a lot to get through.
That's right. And our job, really, is to piece all this together. We're looking at what seems to be a major plan for deploying specialized security forces across the U.S.
And also the legal fights happening around this, plus this pretty dramatic increase in weapons being bought by federal agencies, specifically ICE.
Exactly. So the mission today is to unpack this plan for what they're calling the National Guard Response Force, or NGRF. The aim is to have it operational everywhere by 2026.
All 50 states.
All 50 states and territories. We'll look at that alongside the huge jump in ICE's weaponry budget and how the courts are already grappling with deployments in places like LA and Portland.
And there's this specific date that jumps out, right? This deadline, April 1st, 2026. Why that date? What's the thinking behind needing this rapid deployment force ready to go by then?
That's the hook, isn't it? The sources we have, commentary from within, suggest there's some kind of intelligence, maybe indications that leadership expects something significant to happen around early 2026, January to May specifically.
Which lines up with a, let's say, potentially very tense period politically.
Precisely. It points towards preparations for widespread civil unrest, maybe linked to election cycles or ongoing protest movements.
Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of this nationwide deployment plan. You mentioned this memo, the one laying out the NGRF structure.
Yes, this memo is really the core document outlining the whole strategy. It's not just a suggestion, it's a directive.
A nationwide mandate, you said.
Absolutely. It covers all 53 states and territories. That includes D.C., which apparently needs a unique solution set, handled directly by the Secretary of Defense, which makes sense given D.C.'s status.
And the deadline is firm.
Very firm. NLT no later than April 1st, 2026. All units have to be fully ready, fully mission capable by then.
And what does fully mission capable look like in terms of numbers? How big are these units?
They're talking about units of up to 500 troops for each NGRF. So potentially quite substantial forces spread across the country.
Okay, 500 troops.
Yeah.
But the really striking thing seems to be how fast they need to be ready to move.
That's the critical shift, I think. The mobilization speed required is... well, it's unprecedented compared to current standards.
What is the specifics there?
The memo demands 25% of the force mobilized within 8 hours, then 50% within 12 hours, and the full unit, all 500 troops potentially, ready to go in just 24 hours.
24 hours. Wow. Just to give some context, what's the normal time frame we'd expect for mobilizing the Guard for something like this?
Typically for a major civil disturbance situation, especially one serious enough to maybe involve invoking the Insurrection Act, which we'll definitely get into later, you're usually looking at a minimum of, say, 48 to 72 hours.
Okay, so 2 or 3 days normally.
Right. That buffer, that 72-hour window, is often when governors or local officials might try to manage the situation themselves or, importantly, seek legal challenges, like the restraining orders we saw pop up in Chicago and Portland recently.
So shrinking that window down to 24 hours, that significantly reduces the time for states to push back or for courts to intervene, doesn't it?
It certainly seems designed to do that. It drastically compresses the timeline for any kind of political negotiation or legal review before troops are potentially on the ground. It feels like a move to bypass those traditional checks.
And the training for these NGRF troops, is it standard National Guard stuff or is it more specialized?
Oh, it's highly specialized. The memo is very clear. The training mandate is specifically for civil disturbance operations and crowd control, domestic focus.
So dealing with protests, essentially.
Dealing with protests, crowd management, yes. And they're required to be trained and equipped with specific non-lethal weapons. The documents name tasers and oleoresin and capsicum spray, pepper spray.
So less about general military readiness and more about direct interaction with civilian populations inside the U.S.
Exactly. This isn't about defending against external threats. This is training for internal crowd control, potentially in major cities. And there is another layer some sources point out that personnel being shifted into these NGRF units include specialists in CBRN incidents.
CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear.
Correct. Which suggests they're preparing for scenarios potentially much more severe than just standard protests, high-threat domestic situations.
That CBRN element plus the speed really adds weight to those comments from inside sources saying this is a normal procedure.
It does. When someone familiar with these kinds of orders says they've never seen an order like this before, and that it feels like leadership has specific intelligence about potential trouble between January and May 2026, you have to take that seriously.
It suggests this isn't just about general preparedness. It seems tied to specific concerns about that post-election period.
And likely linked to the kind of unrest we've already seen. The documents mention the context of the No Kings protests, that sort of anti-authoritarian sentiment, and also the very targeted, sometimes violent, protests against ICE operations.
So the thinking seems to be the old way of responding, the 72-hour way, isn't cutting it for the scale or speed of unrest they anticipate, so they need this new, faster mechanism.
That appears to be the rationale, yes. Institutionalizing a rapid response capability because the existing framework is seen as too slow or too easily challenged legally. Okay, so we've talked about the military planning, the NGRF, but to really understand the full picture of domestic security preparedness, we need to look at the law enforcement side too. And that means looking at the spending, specifically at U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE.
Right, and the data we have on their spending, particularly on weapons and related gear, is, well, it's pretty stark.
Stark is a good word. We're looking at the category federal agencies use called small arms, ordnance, and ordnance accessories. Think guns, ammo, that kind of military-style hardware.
And the increase in 2025 was huge.
Huge is an understatement. Reports vary slightly, but it's somewhere over a 600%, maybe even a 700% increase in spending in that category in fiscal year 2025 compared to 2024.
Wow. Do we have dollar figure for that?
We do. Between January 20th and October 18th, 2025, so less than a full year, ICE spent roughly $71.5 million just on those items.
$71 million. How does that compare to previous years?
It absolutely dwarfs them. During the first term of the previous administration, for instance, the average annual spending in that category was around $8.4 million. Go back to FY 2019, it was closer to $5.7 million.
So in less than 10 months, they spent almost 10 years' worth of the previous average.
Basically, yes. It's a massive acceleration in armament acquisition.
Where did the funding for such a massive increase suddenly come from?
A lot of it traces back to the president's major legislative package, the one often called the Big Beautiful Bill. That bill poured enormous amounts of money into border security and federal immigration enforcement. It specifically boosted funding for DHS and ICE, which enabled not just buying all this hardware, but also funding their goal of hiring thousands of new agents. I think the target was an additional 11,000 agents.
And more agents means more weapons needed.
Exactly. More agents and equipping them to a high standard. We saw specific examples like over $9 million spent just on rifles from one company, Geisel Automatics, in a single purchase late in 2025.
So definitely rifles, armor. But the sources also flag significant purchases of chemical weapons. And that leads to that really controversial item that showed up in the spending records.
Ah, yes, the guided missile warheads and explosive components line item. That definitely caused a stir.
I can imagine a domestic agency buying missile components.
Understandably, it set off alarm bells. Political opponents jumped on it. Warnings about the president building an army against Americans. It fed into a very heated narrative.
But what was the official explanation? DHS must have responded.
They did, very firmly. The DHS Assistant Secretary McLaughlin called the reports false, and subsequent analysis, looking closely at the records.
Yeah.
Well, independent reporting suggests that specific $61,218 entry, while filed under that very alarming supply code for missile parts, was most likely a clerical error.
A mistake in the paperwork.
Probably a miscoding. The thinking is it related to purchasing multiple distraction devices, things like flashbangs or maybe acoustic devices. We found other records showing ICE bought similar things from the same supplier under less dramatic-sounding codes.
Okay, so the missile thing was likely an error, but it highlights how closely people are watching this spending.
Absolutely. But even setting aside that specific controversy, the sheer volume of confirmed purchases, the high-caliber rifles, the body armor, the chemical agents like tear gas and pepper balls, that spending is still massive and, frankly, unprecedented for ICE.
And this spending isn't happening in a vacuum. It coincides with reports of increased confrontations, even violence, involving ICE officers during protests and raids.
That's the critical link. It creates this feedback loop. More aggressive tactics are enabled by the new equipment, which leads to more volatile encounters. We've seen documented incidents.
Like the reporter in Chicago?
Right. The CBS reporter whose truck was apparently filled with chemical agents, causing her to vomit. Or in Illinois, Pastor David Black getting hit in the face with a pepper ball. It shows how these non-lethal tools can be used quite aggressively.
And the incidents in Portland seem particularly relevant given the focus on federal responses there.
Definitely. You have the case of Darren Hertzberg, the Marine veteran who ended up hospitalized after being tackled from behind by ICE agents during a protest. There's video of that incident.
I remember seeing that.
And then the really tragic case of Jaime Alanis Garcia in California. He fell from a greenhouse roof during an ICE raid. He wasn't even the target and died. These incidents illustrate the real-world risks when you use these high-intensity, almost paramilitary tactics domestically.
And legal groups are pushing back.
Yes, the ACLU, for example, has filed lawsuits arguing that ICE's reliance on what they call dangerous and indiscriminate use of near-lethal weapons, tear gas, rubber bullets, pepper balls, flash grenades, violates basic constitutional rights, like the right against excessive force. The spending surge is what makes these tactics possible on a wider scale.
So these earlier clashes, Los Angeles, Portland, Chicago, they really set the stage for the NGRF plan and this ICE spending surge, didn't they? They were the test cases where the limits of federal power were really pushed.
Absolutely. They were the proving grounds, you could say. And Los Angeles, in particular, established a really important legal baseline that the NGRF seems almost custom designed to get around.
What happened in LA specifically?
Well, during major protests over immigration raids, the administration sent in a large force, about 4,000 National Guard troops, plus 700 Marines. This was despite local LA officials saying they had the situation under control with civilian police.
And that deployment ended up in court.
It did. And the ruling from Judge Charles Breyer was a landmark. He found that the deployment directly violated the Posse Comitatus Act, the PCA.
The PCA being the law that generally prevents the military from acting as domestic law enforcement.
Exactly. And Judge Breyer was very specific about why it was a violation. He pointed to the troops doing things like setting up traffic checkpoints, actively controlling crowds, establishing perimeters, things that count as civilian law enforcement.
So they crossed the line from military support to direct policing.
That was the finding. Breyer stressed that the exception to the PCA, the Insurrection Act, requires a real demonstrable need. He basically said, look, there were protests, yes, but there was no actual rebellion, and local police weren't overwhelmed. He flatly rejected the administration's claim that the situation demanded military intervention. It was ruled an illegal use of executive power.
A clear pushback from the judiciary. But that didn't stop further attempts in places like Portland and Chicago, often against the wishes of the state governors.
No, it didn't, and that's where the legal arguments got even messier. In Oregon, you had Governor Kotek and her predecessor, Governor Brown, strongly objecting to federal forces. The courts initially issued temporary restraining orders, TROs, to block them.
But the feds eventually won that round in Oregon.
In Oregon, yes. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ultimately allowed the federalization to proceed. They ruled that the president likely did have the authority, under a specific part of the law, 10 U.S.C. Section 12406.
Okay, what does that section allow?
It basically lets the president use the military to enforce federal laws if, in the president's judgment, the regular federal forces can't handle it on their own. The argument was that the ongoing protests and clashes at federal buildings in Portland were stopping federal officers from doing their jobs.
And the court deferred to the president's judgment on that.
Largely, yes. The Ninth Circuit followed a long line of precedent that gives considerable deference to the president on matters of national security and executing federal law. They treated it as a judgment call the courts shouldn't easily override. So, that ruling kind of opened a path. If the president says federal law enforcement is being obstructed, the courts might back off.
But Chicago was different. That involved trying to send in another state's guard.
Exactly. The Chicago situation was maybe the most direct challenge to state authority. They attempted to deploy Texas National Guard units into Illinois, even though Governor Pritzker explicitly said no.
That sounds constitutionally shaky.
It was described by many as unprecedented. While the federal appeals court there, the Seventh Circuit, didn't strike down the federalization order itself, they did uphold the lower court's block on the actual deployment into Illinois. And significantly, the Seventh Circuit made a very important statement clarifying the limits here.
What did they say?
They said, quite pointedly, political opposition is not a rebellion. A protest does not become a rebellion merely because of sporadic and isolated incidents of unlawful activity or even violence committed by rogue participants. That directly counters the idea that any protest with some disruption automatically justifies invoking insurrection powers.
So a much higher bar set in Chicago.
Right.
And that case is still ongoing.
Yes, that one is currently on appeal to the Supreme Court. So the fundamental question of whether one state's guard can be deployed into another unwilling state is still officially up in the air.
Okay, so all these flashpoints really force us to look closely at the specific laws that are being stretched and tested here. If this NGRF gets deployed in 2026, it's going to run right into this legal framework, primarily the Posse Comitatus Act versus the Insurrection Act.
Let's break those down. Starting with Posse Comitatus, the PCA. It dates back to Reconstruction, right? 1878. What's its core function? Its core function is to prevent the federal military, and crucially, that includes National Guard troops once they're federalized under federal command, known as Title X status, from acting like a domestic police force.
So what kind of actions are forbidden?
It forbids them from using what the law calls compulsory power over civilians. That's the key phrase. It means they generally can't stop you, search you, arrest you, set up checkpoints to control movement, conduct investigations, gather evidence, or perform active riot control like dispersing crowds.
And the LA ruling confirmed things like setting perimeters also count.
Yes, Judge Breyer's ruling was important because it clarified that actions like establishing perimeters and controlling traffic points are indeed forms of exercising that prohibited compulsory power over civilians. It's not just about making arrests.
Okay, so PCA is the general rule. Military stays out of policing. But the Insurrection Act provides the exceptions. How does that work? It's much older, right? 1807.
Correct. The Insurrection Act carves out very specific, narrow circumstances where the president can legally deploy federal troops domestically, overriding the PCA. There are essentially three main pathways.
What's the first one?
Section 251. This is the simplest. A state requests help. If a state's legislature or the governor of the legislature can't meet, asks for federal troops to deal with an insurrection within that state, the president can send them. The LA riots in '92 are a classic example of this being used.
Okay, state asks, feds help. What's the second path?
Section 252. This is used when the president determines that unlawful obstructions or conspiracies are making it impossible to enforce federal laws through the normal means courts and civilian law enforcement. It's about widespread obstruction of federal authority itself.
And the third?
Section 253. This one allows deployment if an insurrection, domestic violence, or conspiracy is actively depriving people of their constitutional rights, and the state authorities are either unable or unwilling to protect those rights. This was the section invoked during the Civil Rights Movement to enforce desegregation against state resistance.
Now, for those last two sections, 252 and 253, where the president acts without a state request, isn't there a procedural step required first?
Yes, and it's absolutely critical. Before using force under 252 or 253, the president must issue a formal proclamation. This proclamation has to order the insurgents to disperse and go home peacefully within a limited time.
Kind of like a final warning.
Exactly. It's meant to give notice, a chance for de-escalation before the military moves in. And this is where the NGRF's 24-hour readiness raises serious legal questions.
How so?
Well, if the whole point of the NGRF is to be deployable in 24 hours, how does that square with the requirement to issue a proclamation and then wait a reasonable time to see if people actually disperse? The speed seems designed to shortcut that procedural safeguard built into the law. It potentially undermines the constitutional due process aspect of the Insurrection Act.
That feels like a potential conflict built into the NGRF design itself. Which brings us to that other legal complication, the difference between how Guard units are activated, Title 10 versus Title 32.
Ah, yes. This distinction is absolutely central to how the federal government has tried to navigate around the PCA restrictions in recent deployments.
So Title 10 is when they're federalized.
Right. When the Guard is called up under Title 10 of the U.S. Code, they become part of the federal military structure under the president's command. They're essentially active duty troops for that period, and the Posse Comitatus Act fully applies to them. No civilian law enforcement.
But the workaround involves Title 32.
Precisely. Title 32 status is different. Under Title 32, Guard members can be activated for federal missions, often federally funded, but they remain officially under the command and control of their state's governor.
And because they're still technically state forces.
The Posse Comitatus Act doesn't apply. This means, if the governor agrees, Title 32 troops can perform law enforcement functions like crowd control, traffic management, and providing security, which Title 10 troops cannot.
Okay, so Title 32 is the preferred route if you want Guard troops doing police-like tasks. But you need the governor's okay. What happens when the governor says no, like in Illinois, and they try to send in another state's Guard under Title 32?
That's where it hits a constitutional wall, specifically concerning state sovereignty and the 10th Amendment. Legal experts, like those at the Brennan Center, argue very strongly that using one state's guard, which are state officers exercising state authority under Title 32, to operate inside another state without that state's consent is a fundamental violation of federalism.
Because states are supposed to be equal sovereigns within their own borders.
Exactly. One state can't just unilaterally project its law enforcement power into another state. It would be like, California police deciding to conduct operations in Nevada without Nevada's permission. The Seventh Circuit's skepticism in the Illinois case, even though the final word rests with the Supreme Court, really highlighted how problematic this attempt to use Title 32 to override a governor's objection is. It's seen as a direct assault on state autonomy.
Okay, let's try to make this really practical for people listening. We've got the NGRF plan aiming for 2026 readiness, ICE armed with significantly more gear, and these ongoing legal battles about when and how federal forces can be used domestically. If troops do get deployed, say, during a contested election period or major protests, what should citizens know about their rights on the ground?
That's the crucial question. And resources like the Movement Law Lab and the ACLU offer very clear guidance. The absolute number one point they stress is this: your fundamental constitutional rights do not change based on the uniform of the officer you're dealing with.
So whether as local police, an ICE agent, or a National Guard soldier in federal status, your rights under the Constitution and state law remain the same.
Precisely. Your First Amendment rights to speak and assemble peacefully, your Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, those are constant.
Okay, that's the baseline. Now, thinking specifically about those federalized troops, the ones operating under Title 10, where posse comitatus does apply, what specific actions should people watch out for, things those troops are legally not supposed to be doing?
Based on the PCA and court interpretations like Judge Breyer's, federalized Title 10 troops should not be
stopping, searching, or arresting civilians,
setting up or operating traffic checkpoints for law enforcement purposes,
conducting patrols that assert authority over civilian areas,
engaging in direct crowd control or riot dispersal actions, forming lines, using force to move people,
collecting intelligence or evidence on civilian activities for law enforcement use.
So if people see troops doing those things, that's potential evidence of a PCA violation, something that should be documented.
Absolutely. Detailed documentation, photos, videos, written accounts with times and locations becomes incredibly important, both for immediate safety and for potential legal challenges later on.
And drawing on the experiences of communities like Portland or Chicago that have already faced these kinds of deployments, what practical steps do organizers recommend for community preparedness?
The key takeaway from those experiences is proactive preparation. Guides from groups on the ground emphasize things like, first, know your rights. KYR, materials and training. Get that information out widely and quickly. Make sure people know what troops can and cannot do and their rights to remain silent or refuse searches.
Okay, education first.
Second, mutual aid networks. Set up systems beforehand to provide support, legal aid, medical help, basic needs for anyone arrested, injured, or impacted by the deployment. Rapid access to lawyers is critical.
Makes sense. What else?
Third, rapid response documentation teams. Have organized groups ready to go out immediately and document troop movements, raid locations, and any instances of excessive force or potential PCA violations. Centralized, verified documentation is vital.
Having eyes on the ground, basically.
Exactly. And fourth, pushing for local non-cooperation policies. Encourage mayors and city councils to pass ordinances or executive orders limiting local police cooperation with federal immigration enforcement or federal troops. Think of things like Chicago's ICC zone orders or policies affirming the right to protest. Denying local support can hinder federal operations.
So it's about empowering communities with knowledge, support networks, documentation capabilities, and political pressure points to assert their rights and hold deployments accountable to the law.
That's the strategy, yes, shifting from just reacting to actively preparing and asserting legal limits. So, wrapping this all up, what we're really seeing are two major trends running in parallel, both pointing towards an anticipation of significant ongoing civil unrest in the U.S.
Trend one being the creation of this formal rapid response military capability for domestic use, the NGRF, set to be ready by April 2026.
Right. It's an institutional blueprint designed specifically to overcome the delays and legal challenges that slowed down previous deployments under the existing Insurrection Act framework. It's about speed and bypassing obstacles.
And trend two is the massive arming of the domestic law enforcement side, particularly ICE, with that huge 600, 700% jump in spending on weapons, gear, and chemical agents.
Exactly. The plan for faster deployment, backed up by significantly increased firepower for the agencies likely to be on the front lines. Together, they paint a picture of the government preparing for a scale and intensity of conflict, or potential conflict, that seems tied directly to the political volatility expected around the next major election cycle.
And while the courts have offered some resistance, right, like Judge Breyer in LA, the Seventh Circuit in Chicago, reaffirming that protests aren't automatically rebellions.
Yes, there have been important judicial checks. But the reality is that policy development and military planning often move much faster than the legal system. The courts are still picking apart the details of deployments from months, even years ago.
While the administration is already building the next generation response force designed to deploy in just 24 hours.
Precisely. And that speed fundamentally shifts the legal and practical debate. It moves it away from, can the president legally deploy troops under the Insurrection Act, towards how quickly can they get troops on the ground before meaningful legal or political checks can even be mounted.
Which leads us to a final thought for our listeners. The whole system of checks and balances, especially around using the military domestically, relies on laws like posse comitatus and the procedural steps in the Insurrection Act. These are meant to ensure deliberation and protect civil liberties.
So the question to consider is, what does it mean for the constitutional balance when the government creates a permanent rapid deployment force, the NGRF, that seems inherently designed to prioritize speed above all else? What happens when the operational imperative to deploy quickly potentially overrides the legal and procedural safeguards designed to ensure such power is used cautiously and lawfully? That tension between speed and law is really at the heart of what these documents reveal.